This episode, and at least one that'll follow, are thanks to the comments of a viewer, Brambolcino. So, if this is a good watch, then you can feel free to thank him. And if not, well then I'm sure he can take a little criticism. Today we're back beating my favorite dying horse, my most recent reliable distracting obsession. That is modern society, modern capitalism, and how that relates to modern mental health. We're going to take a deep dive into Erich Fromm, an active academic and author from the 1920s through until his death in 1980. It is safe to say that he is one of the most influential writers on this topic and has influenced the thinking of left-wing academics. If you enjoy the theoretical, the deeply philosophical, and the radical, then this video is for you. Of course, theory will always be an abstraction on reality. If it's a perfect theory, then it wouldn't be a theory, but a description of reality itself. At the same time, I love a good theorist, someone who changes the way that you perceive the world forever. And Erich Fromm is one of those thinkers. So please join me in this deep dive into Erich Fromm's most political book, The Sane Society. Erich Siegelmann Fromm was born in Frankfurt, March 23, 1900, the only child of Orthodox Jewish parents. He studied jurisprudence at the University of Frankfurt, later transferring to the University of Heidelberg to study sociology. He received his PhD from Heidelberg in 1922. During the 20s, he trained in psychoanalysis and entered his own clinical practice. Unfortunately, the nasty rise of Nazism in Germany drove Fromm out. He eventually arrived at Columbia University in 1934. It was in the US where Fromm achieved prominence in both psychoanalysis and in academia. He worked with the Washington School of Psychiatry, the William Allison White Institute, teaching at Bennington College, and the New School for Social Research. Fromm was a professor at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, Michigan State, and New York University. Upon retirement, he moved to Switzerland in 1974, where he died at home in 1980. During his life, he was a notable author and thinker, publishing many articles and books. His best-known book is Escape from Freedom, which was published in 1941. That book is considered a founding work of political psychology. The book I'm focusing on, The Sane Society, published in 1955, is considered the culmination of both his social and political philosophy. The book argues in favor of a humanistic form of democratic socialism. It rejects both Western capitalism as well as Soviet communism. Both these systems he considered to be dehumanizing and resulting in virtually universal modern phenomenon of alienation. As a result, Fromm is considered a founder of socialist humanism. He is considered a key figure in the Frankfurt School of Social Criticism. He came from a neo-Freudian school of psychoanalysis, so he adopts Freudian concepts into his theories on both politics and on society. Key theme of this book is around the notion of human progress, whereas many in the 20th century were often self-congratulatory about human society's capacity to improve itself. Fromm is strongly criticizing this positive outlook. He argues that rather than human civilization improving, our immense material and technical improvements have been costing us our sanity. We have become richer and more physically comfortable, but we've become increasingly alienated at the same time. He argues that humanity is not progressing if that progress is in only one sphere of life. That any progress is undermined if it is at the cost of mental health. He asserts that mental pathology in Western people is increasing, despite the also increasing health and comfort. Well, I'm not sure how you would prove that mental health is deteriorating, as there's no consistent form of measurement between the 19th and 20th century. But it is solidly safe to argue that we've gotten wealthier consistently over the past 200 years, and that we're seeing a huge proportion of our population suffer psychological distress. So I think Fromm's point holds. What is the benefit of wealth and comfort if you can't enjoy it? The Sane Society. What I find especially brilliant about this book is Fromm's analysis of human nature. Love, hate, creation, destruction, security or safety, independence and adventure. We can all observe these contradictions in ourselves. But Fromm puts these contradictions into a clearly articulated hierarchy that feels natural, and as much as I usually hate it, feels moral. He allows for a wide variety of individual expression. He articulates a human morality, but he does that not as an uncomfortably uncompromising one. Most religions try to moralize some human attributes over others, but on the flip will demonize other very common human attributes. Fromm's view of humanity clearly values certain parts of the human experience as more healthy than others, but he applies compassion to the less attractive or less beneficial pieces. Human nature. Central to Fromm's critique is his razor-sharp definition of human nature. Human nature is, he believes, in the themes of Genesis. In the beginning, human beings were simply a part of nature, an animal like any other. He doesn't paint a noble savage character, and this isn't some Rousseau's uncorrupted man. Rather, he says that we sprang from nature, we belong to nature, and when we live by instinct alone, we were unable to question our situation, and as a result, we would experience a naive and unquestioning clarity of being. Anyone with a dog can identify with this sentiment. I mean, give them their basics, your attention and kindness, exercise, maybe some challenges, enough food, and that dog will be extremely happy. A dog doesn't question beyond that. We could describe this blissful naivete as a type of Eden experience. In the Adam and Eve story, humans live in a perfect garden until they choose to eat from the tree of knowledge. But by choosing to ignore God's command, we become free. But we do that at the cost of being aware of ourselves, our separateness, our helplessness, and we lose our naive, unconscious belonging. We make ourselves different, transcendent, yet alone. As a result, we are the most free of all nature. We're able to make conscious choices, or at least aware of our individuality. Yet we are still a product of nature, and we're still subject to it. From birth through to death, we've made a wonderful and a terrible choice. Fromm writes, quote, "The problem of man's existence, then, is unique in the whole of nature. He has fallen out of nature, as it were, and is still in it. He is partly divine, partly animal, partly infinite, partly finite. The necessity to find ever new solutions for the contradictions in his existence, to find ever higher forms of unity with nature, his fellowmen and himself, is the source of all psychic forces which motivate man, all of his passions, affects, and anxieties." Freud also described this deeply rooted tension in humanity. That humans want both to reach their potential, to stretch their intellect, to create, but at the same time they also want to regress towards the safety of a mother's love, to the certainty of the womb. This conflict is a constant internal struggle between relatedness and narcissism. We aren't human without individuality, yet unmeditated absolute individuality is horrifyingly lonely. In this state, we can have all of our physical needs satisfied, food, shelter, but we still feel bereft. Our nature, our past, which is the wellspring of our existence, is in the symbiotic symmetry of maternal nature. So regardless of the protestations of consciousness, We are still a dependent product of the same primordial processes as every other entity that inhabits our spinning globe. Quote, "The necessity to unite with other living beings, to be related to them, is an imperative needs on the fulfillment of which man's sanity depends." Close quote. Up to this point, this is exactly the same conclusion that modern research has non-philosophically identified in the past few decades. We know that any human stripped of dignity, of autonomy, of agency, is subject to all sorts of mental and physical issues. We also know that humans who don't have solid, satisfying relationships suffer from loneliness, and likewise suffer from mental and physical issues. So whether you take the philosophical or the psychological or a purely research-based approach to this question, you arrive at the same point. Human beings need to exercise their independence, and they need to have their solid relationships to be healthy or happy. These two needs are in tension, and these two needs exist regardless of what society we live in. They are inherent human needs, not socially dependent or created needs. We may vary in the relative strength of each need, but everyone exists on the same spectrum. Relatedness, submission, domination, and love. Fromm gives us three possible ways to have our relatedness needs met. We can attempt to dominate others, we can attempt to submit to others, or we can choose to develop love for others. Fromm points out both dominance and submission are tactics that are doomed to fail. Whether we choose to be dominant or submissive in a relationship, that choice demands lost integrity and lost freedom. The dominant isn't satisfied without the symbiotic relationship of the submissive and vice versa. Neither can be connected without the other. Both is only half. As a result, it satisfies our relatedness need to some extent, but it does so at the expense of our need to feel independent. Learning how to love, then, is the only way to satisfy our need for union, for relatedness, that overcomes our sense of loneliness, but without any sacrifice of independence. Fromm says this much better than I can. Quote, "Love is in the experience of human solidarity with our fellow creatures. It is in the erotic love of man and woman, in the love of mother for child, and also in the love for oneself as a human being. It is in the mystical experience of union, in the act of loving. I am one with all, and yet I am myself, a unique, separate, limited, mortal human being. But if I can only love one person and nobody else, if my love for one person makes me more alienated and distant from my fellow man, I may be attached to this person in any number of ways, yet I do not love. If I can say I love you, I say I love you in all humanity, all that is alive. I love you also in myself. Self-love, in this sense, is the opposite of selfishness. The latter is actually a greedy concern with oneself, which springs from and compensates for the lack of genuine love for oneself. Love, paradoxically, makes me more independent because it makes me stronger and happier. That it makes me one with the loved person to the extent that individuality seems to be extinguished for the moment. In loving, I experience I am you. The loved person, you, the stranger, you, everything alive. In the experience of love lies the only answer to being human, lies sanity." Close quote. This definition contains within it an element of Fromm's Orthodox Jewish background. While he was a non-theist, if not an atheist at this point in his life, it seems he still maintains some of the same moral positions. Love isn't only an emotion, it is something bigger and more mature. It's an expression of attachment to a larger community, and it is inclusive, never exclusive. Narcissism and destruction. An inability to love is the opposite of connection or relatedness. It is narcissism. In this case, narcissism is in the original meaning, describing a person who is self-obsessed, with or without egotistical affects, as all children are narcissistic, it is a natural human condition, at least during our early and middle childhood. As we begin to develop the ability to connect and empathize with others, we leave this natural narcissism behind. We begin to understand that others' needs are just as important as our own. If we fail to complete this development, then we remain narcissistic. This narcissism, according to Fromm, is a component of all insanity. Quote, "The insane person has lost contact with the world. He is withdrawn into himself. He cannot experience reality, neither physical or human reality as it is, but only as formed and determined by his own inner processes. Narcissism is the opposite pole to objectivity, reason, and love." Close quote. Quite literally, Fromm is defining sanity as including the ability to identify and connect with others. It's an essential component of a fully developed conscious human. This requirement to love makes our need for independence the sharp edge that we're always balancing on. Achieving independence is to transcend life, to be detached and unique. The most powerful way we can demonstrate this transcendence is by either creating or by destroying. To create is to add to life something uniquely ours. So children, art, craft, self-directed work, all of these satisfy transcendent creativity. To choose to apply ourselves to bring into being something unnatural, something that's tangible, and that demonstrates our human potential, affirms our specialness. At the same time, to choose to destroy, especially something alive, also demonstrates independence. It shows that we have power over people, their possessions, or nature itself. But if we are connected to others, if we love our community and our Mother Nature, then to destroy also hurts us. Any act of destruction is violent upon the proper object of love, upon our community, upon nature, upon the part of ourselves that is incomplete without connection. To love demands care and compassion. It doesn't coexist with destruction. A destroyer is a human painfully stretched to tearing between two uncompromising needs: independence and connection. The maternal and paternal fixations. This central contradiction in humanity, the rigorous demands it places on us, creates the basis of any society that Fromm would endorse. Fromm reorganizes Freud's Oedipus complex theory, keeping the idea that our desire of return to safety, security, and belonging creates a strong attraction to the mother or a maternal figure. Now, Fromm's is not driven by sexual or other physical needs, but rather the inherent human fear of isolation. And can I just say as a side note, thank God, because I've always found the Oedipus complex, as Freud laid it out, as kind of creepy. So, safety, warmth, and connection of early childhood is a deeply etched pattern or program that continues to drive behavior throughout life. Freud's complex placed man in competition with his father as a result of the inescapable attraction to mother. But Fromm's human is driven by his individuality towards paternal figures. A man who's biologically male and thereby not able to birth children is a character that is divorced from nature. As a result, he can embody the artificial, the decisive, and the powerful. The paternal figure exemplifies intellect and logic. It's divorced from emotion. It is expressed in abstractions, the law, duty, hierarchy. The maternal figure is natural and compassionate. It embodies unconditional love. A mother loves her children because they are children. The love of the paternal figure is conditional. It's a set of expectations to be met, a love to be earned. As a person develops and matures out of her childhood, she develops a conscience that encapsulates both of these characteristics. Part of our inescapable nature is a voice that calls for forgiveness, for compassion, for connecting, while the other part is a voice that calls for reason, discipline, and individualism. As she becomes a full, healthy adult, then she becomes her own father, her own mother, and becomes her own child. She internalizes the voices and uses them to support her maturing, growing, or evolving self. Incest. This maturation fails frequently, and these natural human drives can become perverted into a pathology. A desire for connection and belonging for safety becomes a fixation on blood and soil. It's expressed through nationalism, through racism, through sexism or homophobia. Again, another aside, I added sexism and homophobia myself, but I think they fit Fromm's criteria. It means that our belonging to a group is one of excluding those who don't meet the same criteria. The second and paternal type of attraction becomes submission to authority, reveling in hierarchy, accepting inequality. And Fromm is absolutely clear here. To be a mature, sane adult human, we need to have developed within us both capacities and be able to hold the competing demands of these needs in balance. This maturity is demonstrated through brotherliness, a recognition of the value of every human life, and a willingness to apply our individuality to create a community for all. The opposite of this is incest, to descend into blind conformity, xenophobia, to be submissive, authoritarian, or cruel. It drives such perversions as blind loyalty, abandoning of our freedom to regimentation in thought and deed, or using violence to enforce ideas and sacrificing our lives for symbols or abstractions. Quote, nationalism is our form of incest, is our idolatry, is our insanity. Patriotism is its cult. It should hardly be necessary to say that by patriotism, I mean the attitude which puts the own nation above humanity, above the principles of truth and justice. Not the loving interest in one's own nation, which is the concern with a nation's spiritual, as much as with its material welfare, never with its power over other nations. Close quote. Developing a personal orientation. Quite quickly, it becomes clear how Fromm's definition of sanity, of a fully developed, mature human, applies to a specific personal philosophy. A healthy, mature person develops their individuality, an ability to think for themselves, and an ability to see themselves as an active subject of their own powers. An immature person substitutes or hides behind adopted identities, such as I'm an American, I'm a lawyer, a Christian, and so on. They choose to put on a mask and identity that allows them to fall into herd conformity. They prioritize belonging over individuality. While it is proper to talk about a sane, fully developed, mature human, it wouldn't be proper to say that they're done maturing at any point. The process of maturation is a process of developing the faculty for grasping the world through thought. It is the ability to objectively grasp the world as it is and not distorted by desires or fears. This maturation is enhanced by education, by experience, and by constant learning. Therefore, a mature human needs to develop a complex frame of orientation. First, they need to have some rationalization, and this rationalization can be either true or false, but it allows them to make sense of the world and its complexity. This rationalized orientation allows for them to be happy and to feel comfortable in their situation. Religion has pretty consistently played this role for many people, but the non-theistic belief systems, philosophy, and science can also help fill out this role. The more complex and the more the orientation approximates reality, the more mature and developed it is. Complexity allows for the second and higher level of orientation, to have a frame of orientation that objectively grasps reality. It is more than pure intellect as well. It encompasses the natural bodily experience of the world. It encompasses both feeling and action. In other words, it encompasses not only our intellect, but also our nature. Our orientation, developed and tested against reality, becomes a place of synthesis between our human contradictions. It joins our natural connectedness with our intact individuality. Fromm's mature person is clearly a bit of a rebel. He doesn't join the standard expected group identifications most of us do. He maintains a rigid intellectual and philosophical objectivity, and he tries to avoid unconscious conformity. At the same time, this person also prioritizes a compassionate love towards humanity and nature. A personal commentary. I find Fromm's approach pretty inspirational, if it's somewhat impressionistic view of humanity. It's a view that is very broad, and it's in places not that detailed. But what I like is he doesn't become overly optimistic nor pessimistic about humanity. He acknowledges that we have a need to be loving, we have a need to be generous, and so on. He doesn't deny that we can be hateful, that we can be exclusionary, and that we can be destructive. He doesn't give up on aspiring to a higher calling, nor does he descend into some morass of relativistic morality. Instead, what he creates is an aspirational hill with a clear vision for a healthy developed man that's at the top of the hill, and at the bottom, the dependent narcissistic baby. In this way, he lays out a path with a kind reminder that we're going to spend the rest of our lives climbing. He doesn't demonize where we fall short. He accepts that our failures are an opportunity for growth, and that failures are not a confirmation of some kind of defective, sinning soul. This is an interesting addition to leftist thought because it takes the time to set out a society of complex people made up of both good and bad. In fact, inescapably good and bad. If you look at many revered leftist thinkers, there's a clear assumption, and often supported by practical examples, that human beings are good, and the only bad is bad systems. Yet rarely do we see a well-argued reason why we should be so optimistic about our fellow human beings. If we move to the right of the political spectrum, the opposite is true. Capitalism, authority, war, inequality, greed, and so on are all unavoidable because human beings are flawed and inescapably narcissistic. We need violence and we need authority because without control we descend into a horrible Hobbesian anarchy. The right confidently asserts this position, and they're ready with many compelling examples of bad behavior. But they employ few reasons why this should be the case. Fromm then steps into the fray with his psychoanalytical background and says, yes, we're often pretty bad, but we're also capable, and in fact meant to achieve something better. We as individuals are responsible to develop and cultivate our full, mature humanity. We are tasked with becoming fully sane. From a perspective in present, 70 years after Fromm was writing this book, our understanding of people is coming ever closer to Fromm's. We know that a child with a bad background is more prone to all sorts of unhealthy and sometimes antisocial behavior. We know that a healthy upbringing is more likely to turn out balanced and decent humans. We know that narrow, exclusionary tribalism and that unchecked nationalism creates unspeakable violence and horror. We know that narcissism is both antisocial and that it undermines a happy, satisfactory life. We know that healthy and well-connected communities have healthier and more well-balanced members. We know that inequality, that exclusion, that rigid self-righteousness harms people who don't fit a society's acceptable norms. We know that the same unequal, exclusive, and self-righteous communities also don't cultivate the happiness, the health, or the satisfaction of the majority, even if they successfully conform. There is a growing body of research that supports all these conclusions. And it's the same growing body of research that is showing how these social effects are programmed into our DNA and that they trigger epigenetic responses. So this isn't only psychology, and it isn't only intangible emotion. There is a physical reality every human being experiences. We now know conclusively that there is no sharp dividing line between the physiology and the psychology. Fromm is presenting a psychological theory influenced by philosophy, but our scientific knowledge is not disagreeing with his conclusions. If anything, the effects Fromm describes have impacts on individuals more deeply and profoundly than we might expect. Because we have these additional complementary facts, we also then have a strong basis to trust the direction that Fromm is trying to take us in the rest of this book. And with that relatively long overview of the first part of the book, The Sane Society, I'm going to conclude. In the next part, I'm going to move forward in the book to explore how Fromm applies his ideas, how a clear vision for human mental health and for sanity informs our economic and political conditions. I hope that you have enjoyed Fromm's ideas so far, and I hope that you'll join me in this upcoming edition. If you'd like to be notified when that is released, then the subscribe and notification buttons are below. Thanks for staying with me through to the end. This is XCG, and I'm wishing you good weather and good spirits as you walk the road to freedom.